The morning was quiet in the way only a protected park can be. Tall trees stood motionless, sunlight filtering through the leaves in soft, broken patterns. The air smelled clean pine soil, something untouched. Visitors moved slowly along the path, speaking in hushed voices, as if the land itself demanded respect. That's when a man stepped into view. He didn't look like someone important. No uniform, no badge. Just a plain jacket, worn boots, and the relaxed posture of someone who wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. His hair was gray at the edges, his face calm, almost unreadable. He walked alone, hands at his sides, eyes scanning the trail like someone appreciating details others missed. To most people, he looked ordinary, maybe even out of place. The ranger noticed him immediately. From a distance, the ranger straightened, adjusting his hat as his eyes narrowed. He had been stationed there for years, long enough to know who belonged and who didn't. He was used to tourists who asked too many questions, hikers who ignored signs, visitors who thought rules were suggestions. Authority came naturally to him. People usually listened the moment he spoke. This man didn't rush, didn't look nervous, didn't look impressed. The ranger stepped forward, boots crunching against the gravel, his voice cutting cleanly through the quiet. "Hey, you can't just wander through here." Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A few visitors slowed their steps, sensing tension before they fully understood it. The man stopped. He turned calmly, meeting the ranger's eyes without surprise, without apology. "I'm just walking the trail," he said, voice steady, low, controlled. The ranger let out a short laugh, not loud, but sharp enough to sting. "Yeah, this isn't a public sidewalk," he said. "People like you usually don't read the rules." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. A couple nearby exchanged glances. One woman frowned. Another man shifted uncomfortably, pretending to check his phone while still listening. The man in the jacket didn't respond right away. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there calm, as if the insult hadn't landed at all. The ranger mistook the silence for hesitation. "You need a permit to be here." The ranger continued louder now. "And judging by how you look, I doubt you have one." There it was, clear, public, unnecessary. A few people winced, someone muttered, "That was harsh." Another visitor slowed to a stop, completely, curiosity outweighing discomfort. Still, the man remained composed. He looked past the ranger for a moment, at the trees, the trail, the people watching. Then his eyes returned, steady and unblinking. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said simply. The ranger scoffed. "That's what they all say?" The moment stretched. The quiet park no longer felt peaceful. It felt tight, like everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. What no one there understood, what the ranger couldn't possibly imagine, was that this wasn't a man being intimidated. This was a man observing. Every word, every tone, every assumption. And as the ranger stood there, confident in his authority, unaware of who he was speaking to, something subtle shifted in the air. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a quiet certainty that this encounter wasn't going to end the way the ranger expected. Because sometimes, the biggest mistake isn't breaking a rule. It's underestimating the person standing right in front of you. The park had a reputation long before anyone ever set foot on its trails. It wasn't just land, it was protected land. Maintained, monitored, controlled. Every sign, every rope, every marked path existed for a reason. And everyone who entered was reminded of that the moment they arrived. This was not a place where people wandered freely without permission. This was a place where rules mattered. The entrance alone made that clear. Large wooden signs listed regulations in neat rows. Smaller notices warned visitors to stay on designated paths, respect wildlife, and follow ranger instructions at all times. The message was subtle but firmly. This land was beautiful, but it was not casual. You were a guest here, and guests were expected to behave. Most people understood that instinctively. Families spoke more quietly as they walked. Hikers checked their gear. Tourists glanced around, unsure of where they could and couldn't step. The uniform carried weight here. A ranger didn't need to raise their voice to be obeyed. The badge, the hat, the posture, those were usually enough, and this particular ranger knew it. He had worked this park for years, long enough to feel ownership over it, long enough to stop seeing visitors as individuals and start seeing them as categories. Responsible ones, careless ones, people who listened, people who didn't. His job, in his mind, wasn't just protection, it was control. The culture among the staff reflected that mindset. Rangers were trained to be firm, direct, decisive. There wasn't time for long explanations when safety was involved. And over time, That firmness hardened into something else for some of them. A confidence that bordered on ego, a belief that their judgment was always correct, especially when it came to appearances. In a place like this, people who belonged stood out. They wore the right gear, carried the right passes, spoke with the quiet confidence of people who had planned ahead. Others, the ones who didn't fit that image, were watched more closely. The man in the plain jacket didn't fit the image. Against the backdrop of expensive cameras, branded hiking equipment, and guided groups, he stood out precisely because he didn't stand out at all. No logos, no visible credentials, no urgency. He walked like someone who wasn't trying to prove anything. That alone made some people uneasy, the ranger especially. From his perspective, the park functioned on hierarchy. Staff at the top, visitors below. And within those visitors, there were those who understood their place, and those who needed to be reminded of it. He had made that reminder many times before. Usually it ended quickly. A warning. Compliance. That's how it always went. Around them, the park continued its quiet rhythm. Leaves rustled gently in the breeze. A group of tourists paused near a trail marker, whispering to each other as they glanced toward the confrontation. A couple pretended to study a map, clearly listening without wanting to be seen listening. No one intervened. Because in this setting, the ranger was assumed to be right. Authority had a way of shaping perception. When someone in uniform spoke, people leaned toward believing them, even when something felt off. Even when the tone crossed a line. Even when the words carried more judgment than necessity. The man in front of him felt that shift too. Not in fear, but in awareness. He could sense how the space around him had changed. How the park that moments ago felt open and calm now felt like a stage. Eyes on him. Expectations forming. Silent assumptions being made. And still, he remained where he was. The ranger's confidence grew with every second that passed without resistance. Silence to him meant surrender. It meant he had already won the exchange. He stood straighter, shoulders squared, certain that the situation was under control. What he didn't notice was how carefully the man was taking everything in. The signs, the staff behavior, the way people deferred without question. This place wasn't just about nature. It was about power, who held it, and how comfortably they used it. The irony was quiet, almost invisible. In a space built to preserve humility before nature, arrogance had found a home. And the longer the moment stretched, the clearer it became that this encounter wasn't just about rules or permits. It was about assumptions. About who gets respect automatically, and who has to earn it in the eyes of others. No one there yet understood how wrong those assumptions were. The park stood still. The ranger waited. The man remained calm. And somewhere in that silence, the balance of authority was already beginning to shift, slowly, invisibly, but inevitably. Before we move on, tell me this in the comments: did the ranger cross the line here, or was he just doing his job? The ranger took a step closer, close enough now that the space between them felt intentional. He glanced once more at the man's clothes, the scuffed boots, the plain jacket, as if confirming a judgment he had already made the moment he first saw him. His mouth tightened, not with concern, but with irritation. "You know," he said, voice carrying farther than necessary, "this area isn't for casual wandering." A few heads turned again. The words were framed as instruction, but the tone was something else entirely. The man looked at him calmly, waiting. The ranger continued, encouraged by the attention. "We get people like this all the time," he said, gesturing vaguely with one hand. "They think because it's quiet, because no one's watching, they can just walk wherever they want." The phrase "people like this" landed hard. A couple standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. One of them opened his mouth, then closed it again. No one spoke. The man didn't interrupt. He didn't correct him. He simply listened. That restraint seemed to bother the ranger even more. "You didn't see the signs?" the ranger asked, eyebrows raised. "Or do you usually ignore rules and hope no one calls you out?" His voice was sharper now, edged with sarcasm. The kind meant not just to correct, but to embarrass. The man finally answered, evenly, "I saw the signs." The ranger laughed, a short sound that echoed just a little too loudly in the open space. "Sure you did." He looked around, briefly acknowledging the small audience. "Then you'd know this trail is monitored. It's not for sightseeing strolls." The implication was clear. This man didn't belong, not here, not among people who knew what they were doing. The ranger folded his arms. "Let me guess," he said. "You drove in, parked wherever you felt like, and decided to explore." The man shook his head once. Slowly, "No," he said. The ranger smirked, as if the answer didn't matter. Funny how it's always no after the fact. There was a pause, long enough for the insult to settle. A woman nearby frowned openly now. Another visitor looked at the ground, uncomfortable with how personal the exchange had become. This wasn't about safety anymore. It was about power. The ranger leaned in slightly. Do you even have a permit? The man met his eyes. I don't need one. That was the moment. The ranger's expression changed, not to surprise, but to offense. His jaw tightened and his voice rose a notch. Excuse me. I don't need a permit, the man repeated calmly. A murmur rippled through the small group. Someone whispered, that's not how this works. The ranger straightened, clearly enjoying what he believed was the upper hand. Everyone needs a permit, he said, unless you think the rules don't apply to you. The accusation hung there, heavy and deliberate. The man said nothing. Silence followed again, but this time it wasn't neutral. It was charged. The ranger mistook it for defiance. Look, he said, impatience creeping in, I don't have time for games. You're holding up the trail, and frankly, you're making people uncomfortable. That last part wasn't true, and several witnesses knew it, but it sounded official enough to pass. The man glanced briefly at the people around them. He could see the mix of emotions, curiosity, discomfort, quiet disagreement. Then he looked back at the ranger. I'm not trying to cause a problem, he said. The ranger scoffed again. That's another classic line. He uncrossed his arms and pointed down the path behind the man. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn around, head back the way you came, and if you want to come back properly, you'll do it the right way. The command was firm, public, absolute. The ranger waited, expecting movement, an apology, resistance, something. Nothing happened. The man didn't move. That was when irritation tipped fully into arrogance. You hear me? The ranger said louder now. I said turn around. The man looked at him steadily. There was no challenge in his eyes, no anger, just patience. I heard you, he said. Then why are you still standing here? Another pause. Because you're wrong, the man replied quietly. A few people inhaled sharply. Someone muttered, oh no. The ranger's face flushed. Wrong, he repeated. You don't get to decide that. His voice carried now, echoing off the trees. I do. That's my job. The ranger took another step forward, crowding the space deliberately. And my job says you don't belong here. The words were no longer about rules. They were about identity. About who was allowed to stand where. The man didn't step back. He didn't step forward either. He remained exactly where he was. And in that stillness, the ranger made his biggest mistake yet, not realizing that every insult, every assumption, every raised tone was being witnessed, remembered, and quietly measured. Because what he saw as authority was starting to look, to everyone else, like something very different. The ranger expected something, an argument, an apology, even anger. Anything that would confirm the role he had already assigned, but the man gave him none of it. He stood there quietly, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders loose, breathing steady. His face showed no irritation, no embarrassment. If anything, it looked almost thoughtful, as if he were listening not just to the ranger's words, but to everything underneath them. The ranger mistook that calm for uncertainty. You're awfully quiet now, he said, tilting his head slightly. That usually means people realize they've gone too far. The man didn't respond. The silence stretched, and in that stretch, something subtle began to shift. The ranger was still talking, still filling the space, but the attention of the people around them was no longer on his authority. It was on the man who refused to be pulled into the noise. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't defend himself. He simply watched. The ranger cleared his throat, uncomfortable with how little control he felt despite how loudly he spoke. Look, I'm trying to keep this simple, he said. You can make this easy, or you can make it difficult. The man lifted his eyes slightly, meeting the ranger's gaze again. His expression didn't change, no fear, just awareness. I'm not making anything difficult, he said. His voice was low even, not firm, just steady. That steadiness landed harder than any raised voice could have. The ranger frowned. He wasn't used to people speaking like that to him. Most visitors rushed their words, explained too much, stumbled over themselves when questioned. This man spoke only when necessary, and when he did, there was no urgency behind it. You're standing in a restricted area, the ranger said again, slower this time, as if repetition would somehow force compliance. You need to leave. The man didn't move. He looked past the ranger briefly, not dismissively, but calmly, as if taking in the larger scene. The trail, the trees, the people who had gathered without meaning to. Then his eyes returned. "I'll leave when I'm finished," he said. The words were simple. No threat, no attitude, just a statement. A few people nearby exchanged looks. One of them raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. Another felt a strange sense of relief, like watching someone refuse to be pushed without ever pushing back. The ranger felt it too, though he wouldn't have named it that way. To him, the calm felt wrong. Dangerous. Like standing near deep water that looked still on the surface. "You don't get to decide that," he said, though the edge in his voice had softened. "I do." The man nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "Maybe," he said. That single word unsettled the ranger more than any argument would have. There was no defiance in it, no challenge, just confidence, quiet, grounded, unshaken. The ranger shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on them, of how the conversation had stopped feeling one-sided, of how the man's silence had turned into a mirror, reflecting every unnecessary word back at him. The man remained exactly where he was. He wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He wasn't trying to prove something. He was simply refusing to be diminished. That kind of presence was unfamiliar to the ranger. Authority to him was something you asserted, something you reinforced through commands and consequences. This man's authority, whatever it was, didn't need reinforcement at all. The ranger took a step back without realizing it, not far, just enough to breathe. The man noticed but didn't react. He had seen this before. The moment when aggression runs out of momentum. When loud certainty starts to feel hollow. When someone realizes that volume and confidence aren't the same thing. Around them, the park seemed to lean in. The breeze moved through the trees. Leaves shifted underfoot. The world continued as if nothing extraordinary was happening, even though something very important was. The ranger opened his mouth to speak again, then hesitated. The man waited, patient still, unmoved, and in that waiting, the balance of the moment tipped, not through force, not through words, but through restraint. Through a silence that carried more weight than any command. Before we go on, pause for a moment and tell me in the comments, what do you think gives someone real authority? The uniform they wear, or the way they carry themselves? The silence didn't end the moment. It thickened it. People who had planned to keep walking slowed without realizing it. A couple stopped altogether near the trail marker, pretending to study the map while listening closely. A family lingered farther back than necessary, the parents exchanging looks that said this was no longer just a routine ranger interaction. Whispers began to move through the air, low and careful. "Something's off," someone murmured. "That guy's not acting scared at all," another replied. The ranger felt the shift before he fully understood it. What had started as a simple correction now had an audience. Not a loud one, not an obvious one, but an attentive one. And attention, when it lingers too long, has a way of changing the rules. He cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders again, reminding himself who was and where he stood. "You're drawing a crowd," he said, as if that alone were an accusation. The man glanced around calmly. "I didn't ask anyone to stop," he said. That was true, and the ranger knew it. A junior ranger stood several yards away now, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid being pulled in. He watched the exchange with unease, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He had seen warnings issued before. He had seen arguments too. This was neither. It felt like waiting for something unseen to surface. The ranger lowered his voice slightly, though it still carried. "You need to understand how this looks," he said. "I'm responsible for what happens here." The man nodded once, acknowledging the responsibility without conceding anything else. Behind them, a woman leaned toward her friend. As being polite, she whispered, "Why is the ranger pushing so hard?" Her friend shrugged but didn't answer. Time stretched in uncomfortable ways, the kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. The ranger glanced around, realizing that instead of reinforcing his authority, every extra second was giving the moment more weight. He tried again, this time with a different angle. "If you cooperate," he said, "this ends quickly." The man's expression didn't change. "I am cooperating," he replied. The ranger hesitated. That wasn't the answer he had prepared for. A man farther back squinted at the figure in the plain jacket, studying him more carefully now. Something about the posture, the stillness, the way he stood without shrinking or expanding. The man frowned, as if searching his memory for a connection he couldn't quite place. "Does he look familiar to you?" he whispered to his partner. She shook her head, unsure. "Maybe, I don't know." The ranger felt a flicker of doubt, quickly smothered by pride. He had handled situations like this before. He reminded himself of that. He just needed to close it out. "I'm going to ask you one last time," he said, firmness returning. "Turn around and leave." The words echoed faintly against the trees. The man didn't answer immediately. He didn't move either. Instead, he looked at the ranger with the same steady calm, as if measuring not the command, but the person behind it. That look, quiet, unhurried, made the ranger's skin prickle in a way he didn't expect. A phone appeared briefly in someone's hand, then disappeared again. No one wanted to be obvious, but several people were already thinking the same thing. Whatever this was, it felt important. The junior ranger took a tentative step forward, then stopped himself. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, then closed it again. Something told him this wasn't his place. The man finally spoke. "There's no need to escalate this," he said. The ranger exhaled sharply. "You're the one escalating." A couple of bystanders exchanged looks. One of them shook his head slightly, not in disagreement with the ranger's authority, but with the way it was being used. The ranger glanced around again, aware now that the scene had slipped beyond his control, not outwardly, not officially, but socially. People weren't siding with him automatically anymore. They were watching him. That realization made him uneasy. He stepped back half a pace, then caught himself and squared his shoulders again, as if the movement hadn't happened. "I'm calling this in," he said. "Well sorted out properly." The man inclined his head. "That's fine." The ranger paused. He had expected resistance, anxiety, anything other than agreement. As he reached for his radio, a hush settled over the group. Conversation stopped. Even the breeze seemed quieter. The ranger spoke into the device, his tone professional but clipped. He gave his location, briefly described the situation, requested assistance. As he lowered the radio, he noticed how many eyes were on him now. Not hostile, just observant. The man in the jacket remained still, hands relaxed, gaze forward. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look concerned. He looked like someone who knew exactly how this would unfold and had no need to rush it. That was when the realization began to ripple outward, not yet clear, not yet named, but felt. This wasn't a man trapped in a situation. This was a man allowing it to play out. And as footsteps approached in the distance, the witnesses sensed they were about to understand why. The sound of footsteps came first, measured, deliberate, unmistakably purposeful. They grew louder along the trail, breaking the stillness that had settled over the group. Heads turned in unison. Conversation stopped completely. The ranger straightened instinctively. From between the trees emerged a senior official, uniform crisp, posture calm, eyes already scanning the scene before a word was spoken. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't casual either. This was someone who understood situations before stepping into them. His gaze landed briefly on the ranger. Then it shifted. The moment his eyes found the man in the plain jacket, everything changed. It was subtle, a pause half a second longer than necessary, a tightening around the eyes. Recognition, not dramatic, not loud, but immediate. The official stopped walking. For a breath, no one moved. "Sir," he said quietly. The word landed differently than any command had before. The ranger frowned, confused by the tone. "There's been an issue," he began, eager to regain control of the narrative. "This man," the official raised a hand gently, without even looking at him. "Give me a moment," he said. The ranger stopped mid-sentence. That alone sent a ripple through the crowd. The official stepped closer to the man, his voice lower now, respectful. "I didn't expect to see you out here today." The man nodded once. "I had some time." The exchange was calm, familiar, unequal in a way the ranger hadn't anticipated. The ranger's mouth opened slightly. He looked from one face to the other, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The official turned then, finally addressing him. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" The ranger swallowed. "He was in a restricted area," he said, a trace of defensiveness creeping in. "Didn't have a permit. Refused to leave." The official listened without interrupting, eyes steady. When the ranger finished, there was a brief silence. Then the official looked back at the man. "Is that accurate?" he asked. The man's response was calm, measured. "I was walking the trail. I wasn't informed of any issue until I was spoken to." The official nodded slowly. He turned fully to the ranger now. "This is Mr. Norris." The name fell into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. A few people gasped softly. Someone whispered it under their breath, disbelief sharpening into clarity. A man near the back let out a quiet, stunned laugh. The ranger froze. The color drained from his face as the realization hit, hard and unmistakable. His confidence evaporated in an instant, replaced by something raw and unguarded. I didn't, he stammered, words suddenly difficult to find. The official continued, not unkindly. Mr. Norris has full authorization to be here. More than that, he's someone this park, and this department, respects deeply. The ranger's shoulders sagged. He looked smaller now, as if the uniform had lost its weight. I wasn't aware, he said quietly. I can see that, the official replied. The crowd stood motionless, absorbing the shift. What moments ago had felt tense now felt heavy with meaning. This wasn't about a name alone. It was about how quickly assumptions had turned into actions. The man Norris spoke then, his voice even almost gentle. You were doing your job, he said. The ranger looked up, startled. But, Norris continued, how you do it matters. No accusation, no anger. Just truth. The official nodded in agreement. Authority doesn't excuse disrespect, he said. It demands better. The ranger lowered his head. You're right, he said. I crossed a line. The admission surprised more than one person. The official placed a hand on the ranger's shoulder, firm but steady. This will be addressed, he said. Professionally. The ranger nodded, relief and regret mixing on his face. Norris glanced around at the people who had gathered, the witnesses, the quiet observers, the ones who'd felt the tension without understanding why. He offered a small, polite smile, brief, unassuming. Then he turned back toward the trail. The official stepped aside without being asked. As Norris walked away, the path seemed to open naturally in front of him. No one spoke. No one needed to. The ranger watched him go, understanding settling in slowly now, not just of who he had spoken to, but of what he had revealed about himself. The park returned to its rhythm. Birds resumed their calls. Leaves rustled again. Conversations restarted, quieter than before. But something lingered. Before you go, share this with me. What moment in this story stood out to you the most? Your feedback helps shape what comes next, and more powerful stories are on the way. The moment passed without ceremony. There was no applause, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet understanding that something important had unfolded, and that everyone present had witnessed it in real time. Norris continued down the trail at the same unhurried pace he'd kept from the beginning. His steps were steady, unremarkable, almost deliberately so. If someone hadn't known what had just happened, they might have assumed he was just another visitor enjoying the park. That was the point. Behind him, the ranger remained still for a moment longer than necessary. He watched the man disappear between the trees, the weight of the encounter settling in layers rather than all at once. Embarrassment was there, yes, but beneath it was something deeper. Recognition. Not of a name, but of a mistake. The senior official stayed beside him, allowing the silence to do its work. You handled the situation, the official said finally, voice calm. But you lost sight of the person. The ranger nodded slowly. I did. This wasn't a lecture. It didn't need to be. The lesson had already landed. Around them, visitors resumed their walks, though many glanced back over their shoulders, replaying the moment in their minds. A couple whispered to each other about what they'd seen. One woman shook her head softly, not in anger, but in reflection. What struck most of them wasn't who the man was. It was how he had been. He hadn't demanded respect. He hadn't announced authority. He hadn't corrected the insult with force. He had simply stood firm, calm and present, allowing everyone else to reveal themselves through their actions. The ranger exhaled slowly. I thought authority meant control, he said. The official replied without hesitation. Authority means responsibility, especially in how you speak to people. The ranger nodded again, this time more firmly. I understand. And he did. Norris, meanwhile, had already reached a quieter stretch of the trail. Sunlight broke through the canopy overhead, warming the ground in irregular patches. He paused briefly, not to look back, but to take in the view ahead, unchanged, untouched, exactly as it should be. He didn't need acknowledgement. The encounter was already complete. Later that day, the story would be retold in pieces, among visitors, among staff, in hushed conversations that started with, "You won't believe what I saw today." But the details would shift depending on who told it. Some would focus on the name, others on the ranger's reaction. A few would remember something else entirely. They'd remember the silence. They'd remember how calm can be more powerful than confrontation, how dignity doesn't need permission, how assumptions, once spoken aloud, reveal more about the speaker than the target. And they'd remember how quickly power can change hands, not when someone takes it, but when someone misuses it. The ranger would carry that lesson forward. Not as a punishment, but as a correction. A reminder that uniforms don't grant superiority. They grant obligation. Norris never mentioned the incident again. He didn't need to. Because the strongest lessons are rarely the loudest ones. They're the ones that unfold quietly, in front of witnesses, and leave everyone a little more aware than they were before. If there's one thing this moment shows, it's this: respect isn't about who you recognize. It's about how you treat people before you know who they are. More stories like this are coming. And if there was a moment here that stood out to you, or a part that made you pause and think, share it. Your perspective helps shape what we bring next.